Hello, this is Doug Kaye, and this is another one of my videos for the Arcanum. In this video, I want to talk about how to choose a lens for your shots. Now, I'm not talking about the brand of the lens or the cost of the lens. I'm talking specifically about one thing today, and that's how to select the right focal length of your lens. So here's an example. I stood in one place, and I took this shot with a normal lens. That's the normal view right there. And this is the telephoto view. I simply changed the lenses, stayed in the same position, and this is the telephoto lens. This is a longer focal length. And this one is the wide angle view. This is a short focal length lens. So again, same position, normal, telephoto, and wide angle. Now, when you get started in photography, most people get a camera with a kit lens, and that kit lens is usually a zoom lens, and that's a lens where you can adjust the focal length. You can probably go from a wide angle to a telephoto through normal in the middle. But another kind of lens is a prime lens. A prime lens is one that doesn't zoom. It has a fixed focal length, so a prime lens is always going to be either normal or wide angle or telephoto. It's not adjustable in any way. So why do we have lenses with different focal lengths, and why do we have zoom lenses? One reason, of course, is that we can get a wider field of view into our shots or a narrower field of view into our shots. And in fact, that's how the new photographer thinks about focal length. They think that this is essentially a tool for cropping. Cropping is something, of course, we can do in post-production as well. But the idea is to use a lens to basically make a wider shot or a tighter shot and not have to move. But this is not always the best reason to select the focal length for your shot. You might have heard the phrase, zoom with your feet, but what does that really mean? Well, what it means is rather than simply adjust your zoom lens for a wide angle or a telephoto, to actually move closer to your subject or move farther away in order to change the field of view. So what's the difference between zooming with your feet or zooming with a lens? If you're just shooting a flat scene where you have no real difference between a foreground and a background, then it probably doesn't matter. Again, if the scene is essentially two-dimensional, then it doesn't really matter whether you zoom with your lens or zoom with your feet. Here's an example of what I mean. Here's a test chart shot with a normal lens, and as you can see, it pretty much fills the frame. Now, what happens if I move closer and simply change to a wide-angle lens? I get roughly the same shot. You really can't tell the difference very much. And now, here's a third version where I've stepped way back, but I've changed to a telephoto, a long focal length lens. Again, you can't really tell the difference, and the reason is that this is a flat image. Flat in the sense that it's really two-dimensional to begin with. There's nothing closer to the camera than something else. There's no foreground versus background. There's just one plane of the image. But focal length doesn't just change the field of view. There are a couple of other things that the focal length changes quite a bit also. Number one is perspective or depth. We'll talk about that specifically in this video. The other is depth of field, which is something we'll address in another video. Okay, I've enlisted 3 volunteers here in my studio to help me illustrate some of the points I want to make in this video. Here's a shot taken with a normal lens. And I want you to notice in particular that the giraffe in the background is roughly half the height of the bird in the foreground. This again is a normal lens. We would expect there to be some fall off in size as you go from foreground to background. That's how we perceive things naturally with our own eyes. Now, here's the same scene shot with a telephoto lens. I had to move back. What I wanted to do in this shot is keep the bird the same height as in the normal shot. But if you look now, you'll see that the giraffe is roughly the same height as the bird. And this is because we're using a longer focal length lens. Also take a look at the depth. Here's the normal one once again, and notice the distance between the foreground and the background objects. Now here's the telephoto version, and you'll see that distance is highly compressed. It doesn't appear to be nearly as much difference between the foreground and the background objects. Again, here's the normal lens, and here's the telephoto version. So what about a wide angle? Here's a wide angle lens of the same scene. In this case, notice that the giraffe in the background is now less than 1/4 of the height of the bird. This also gives us quite a bit more depth and separation in the image. Again, here's the normal version, And here's the wide angle version. Changing the focal length changes the relationship between the foreground and the background. That's the most important thing about selecting the right focal length for your images, which is what do you want the relationship between the foreground and the background to be? Now, if you don't have a foreground or background, again, this doesn't matter. If you're trying to shoot a wildlife and you have to use a very long focal length just to catch the moving animal, that's one thing. But even in the case of landscapes, some of the best landscapes you'll see have a bold, strong foreground element, which is either considered important in the shot or minimized in the shot. And that's why that photographer was going to pick a particular focal length. The idea is to select your focal length for creative reasons, not simply to crop. Cropping you can always do by moving or do it in post-production. Take a look again at the normal lens. What do we see here? The foreground and background relationship is normal. There's a certain amount of fall off in size as you move from foreground to background, and it's sort of similar to what we'd expect, what we see with our own eyes. The objects in the background are reduced in size at pretty much a normal rate. Now, to compress your foreground and background, you go to this longer focal length, what we call the telephoto lens. Now, the foreground and background objects actually appear closer to one another than they really are. The apparent size differences between the foreground and the background are reduced. Your image is flatter. There's much less of a sense of depth. You've removed that natural sense of depth and you've enhanced the similarities between the objects in the foreground and the background. If you want to show similarity, a long lens is a good way to go. But this also makes the image less realistic, more abstract. That may be something you're looking for, in which case, again, that's a good choice. You, the photographer, and the viewers of your image are going to feel more distant, more removed from the subject. And in fact, you are. You're less engaged. You're more of an observer. The idea is this is more like watching somebody through a telescope, almost spying on them. And that's the effect that you get from a long focal length. So now let's take a look at the other extreme. Let's go to the wide angle lens. Here, you're obviously much closer. The bird's beak was only about 1 inch from the front of my lens. In this case, you're much more engaged with your foreground subject. You're much closer, you feel much closer, but again, it's less natural. There's a certain distortion here. This is a great way to emphasize the difference between your foreground and your background. If you want to contrast the foreground and the background, wide angle is an effective tool, as opposed to the telephoto, in which case we emphasize the similarity of the foreground and the background. Okay, here's one more example to make this really, really clear. In this shot, the bird is just about 1 foot in front of the test chart. And you can see this one's taken with a normal lens. Looks pretty normal, right? Now, here's the wide angle lens. What I've done here is I've changed to a wide angle lens and moved way in until I have the same field of view. So here's the normal lens field of view. Here's the wide angle field of view. Notice that the width of the shot on the wall is the same. But notice that the bird is much, much larger with the wide angle lens. Again, what I've done by using a wide angle lens and going in closer is altering the relationship of the foreground and the background. So I hope you found this helpful. The idea I want to get across once again is that changing focal length changes the relationship between the foreground and the background. So the next time you go out to shoot and you have to decide where to set the focal length on your zoom lens or which prime to put on your camera, I hope you'll think not just in terms of the field of view, but in terms of how you can creatively control the relationship of your foreground and background. Again, for the Arcanum, I'm Doug Kaye. Thanks for watching.